Okay, fantastic. So the first question, please would each of you introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about how you started working with DH and also the role that it plays for you today in your research and your teaching. So we can switch the order around each time, but how about this, for this first question, we kick off with Rachel.
Hi, everyone. I'm sure there are some familiar names, at least in the participants list. So my name is Rachel Midura. I graduated from Stanford in 2020 with a PhD from the history department. I had been active with CESTA since really arrival. When I came to Stanford, I knew I wanted to work on the history of information and communication in general. And I was really curious what network analysis would do for me for that. So, you know, my advisor, Paula Finland, had been associated with the Republic of Letters project. I met with her and talked about, I met with Nicole Coleman, who was in CESTA at the time, and talked about what opportunities might be available to me as a graduate student. And from there, I did the whole trifecta of the DH certificate, followed by the fellowship, and then acted as a senior research fellow, meaning that I worked with the conveners of the fellowship to, record and evaluate how it was working. I had such a great time at the CESTA community that I always appreciate coming back. And I'm looking forward to talking more about, how it led me into the role that I am currently in.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Great, so let's move to Xander.
Great, thanks, May. And thanks for inviting me to be a part of this. My name is Xander Manshel. I'm an assistant professor of 20th century and contemporary American literature at McGill University. I am an alum of the Stanford English PhD program. I graduated in 2019. And I first got involved in the digital humanities when I arrived at Stanford. That's why I wanted to come to Stanford. And so I was very drawn to and got myself immediately involved in the literary lab out of the English department. And as time went on, more and more activities at CESTA. I was a researcher in the literary lab working on projects there and getting exposed to way more projects than I even had time to participate in. And that really got me excited to look for ways to incorporate DH research into as many humanities projects as I could, and to think about different ways that I could answer questions I was already asking and my colleagues were already asking with these new and exciting methods. Like Rachel, I also participated in the graduate fellows program in DH through CESTA, and actually Georgia was the one who led that the year that I took part in that. And at the end of my time at Stanford, I applied for this job at McGill, which was it's a 20th century and contemporary literature job. It's not a DH specialist job by its official name, but it's a huge center for DH. So I kind of feel like I've won the lottery moving from one really exciting center for this kind of research to another on the opposite, much colder coast.
Thank you so much, Xander. So Sarah, how about you? Take the lead.
Sure, I'm Sarah Murray. I'm an assistant professor in classics at Toronto. I'm like the geriatric assistant professor in this situation. I got my PhD at Stanford back in 2013, back in the Stone Age of digital humanities. I started taking courses in GIS, so spatial technology, when I was an undergraduate, primarily because I wanted to work on archaeological projects. I'm an archaeologist, and I wanted to have some kind of tool that was useful to people that the old timers wouldn't know how to use, that would kind of make me a valuable asset on these projects. So when I got to Stanford, I got involved in the Grand Tour Travelers Project, which was part of the Republic of Letters, because at that stage, Giovanna Cesarani, who was in charge of the project, was interested in doing some mapping and sort of database development. And I had those skills, so I was fortunate enough to be brought into the project. And so spent a lot of time during my PhD working with Nicole Coleman and Giovanna and the rest of the amazing Republic of Letters team, trying to think through how to format our data, how to make databases and data visualizations kind of meaningful. So I have been involved, I was involved with that project at Stanford. It wasn't my main research. I was doing research on the Bronze Age in the Aegean in Greece. But it was really valuable and helped me think more broadly about digital tools and how they could be used in humanities research. Yeah, these days I continue to use a lot of digital tools in research. In archaeology, it's sort of necessary, from spatial analysis and databases to advanced imaging technologies like RTI and photogrammetry. So yeah, I use digital stuff all the time. I don't know if I think about it as digital humanities anymore, rather than as just the things I use to do my research.
Right.
But it's certainly a thoroughgoing part of my career.
Thank you so much. It is amazing actually to see the range of different methodologies under the broad church of DH that are actually represented in this panel today. So that's really exciting. Georgia, over to you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Georgia Henley. I'm a medievalist. I'm an assistant professor of English at St. Anselm College, which is a small liberal arts college in New Hampshire. This is my 4th year in that job, which seems crazy because I feel like I just got there, but then there was the pandemic. So I actually only was on campus for 1.5 years. So it doesn't feel like 4 years, but it is. My PhD is in Celtic languages and literatures. I graduated in 2017 from Harvard. While I was a student there, I got into DH by taking different workshops with the history department's DH initiative that was being developed. And I was a digital teaching fellow for a class with Dan Smale, if any of you guys know Daniel Smale at Harvard. So I was sort of picking up DH skills as a graduate student. And then I had a postdoc at CESTA from 2017 to 2018. I was working on Elaine Jaharn's project, English manuscripts from 1060 to 1220. And I also, as Alexander mentioned, ran the Digital Humanities Fellows Program at CESTA with Luca Schultz. That postdoc lasted for 2 years, but I left after 1 year because I got the job at St. Anselm College. And in terms of my research, I'm currently working on a book project on 14th century Welsh political writing. And it's a traditional print monograph, but it does think through some ideas of network theory and transmission networks to think about the transmission of texts between Wales and England in the 14th century. And I have a DH side project related to that that's interested in the relationship between networks of textual transmission and monastic orders. And I'm currently cleaning a data set to use with Gephi to sort of visualize whether monasteries tended to copy books amongst themselves according to order, or whether they traded outside of their own orders to get books that they wanted. So it's sort of, I found it kind of tricky to negotiate how to publish a traditional print monograph with a DH project as kind of a sidecar to it. So that's maybe something that we could talk about in the breakout rooms, because I'm sure many of you other humanists are kind of struggling with, okay, how do I write a book to get, if I want to get a tenure track job and then write a book to get tenure, well, how does DH fit into all of that? So that's kind of a complicated issue. And in terms of teaching, I have been able to incorporate some DH stuff into just my medieval literature and other literary classes that I've taught the last couple of years. And I'm interested in building more of a presence of DH on my campus with a couple of other humanities faculty who do DH, but I wish I could talk more about that, but I don't think I should say anything on the record about that right now. It's kind of a strange time, but I'm hoping that in the future there will be more DH stuff going on my campus, hopefully soon. So yeah, I think I'll stop there and we can go on to the next question.
Thanks so much, Georgia. That all sounds very exciting. And now we're all going to be in suspense trying to wait and see what happens over at St. Anselm College. So I guess the next question I think that would be really helpful for us all to hear your answers to is about how you got into the role that you have now. And so for those of you who came straight from the PhD into an assistant professorship, were you specifically looking at DH roles? Did you look at a mixture of roles? Did you cast the net as widely as you could? Did that mean presenting yourselves in different ways in your different documents? And did that mean kind of framing things differently for different audiences? For those of you who've held various postdocs, how did they lead into the role that you have now? And what role did DH play in each of those transitions? So I think this is the question that's going to be different for each of you, but it'll be really great to hear your own experiences. So this time, how about we kick off with Sarah?
Sure. Yeah. So when I finished my PhD, which was a while ago now, like everybody else, I applied for any job that I thought I was vaguely qualified for. The classics job market is not super great now, and was not then. So I don't think I applied for DH positions specifically. Again, I have done a lot of stuff with digital humanities, but I don't primarily identify myself as like a digital humanities person. And I think in archaeology, for archaeologists, it's a complicated question because it's kind of a social science, it's kind of a humanities. We use a lot of applied digital humanities just to record the stuff we have in the field. So in a lot of ways, our relationship with technology goes back much farther than most humanists. We've been using spatial technologies and things for a lot longer, I think, than people say in an English department. In any case, I was really focused on the kind of content of the research, right, in the sense that I was trying to produce outcomes that other classicists, would be interested in, rather than the kind of methods or the digital approach. I did use a sort of big data approach and like a spatial approach in my project, but it didn't occur to me to pitch it as a methodologically interesting thing, rather than just a thing that gave an answer to a question that people in the local discipline would care about. So my first job was just in a classics department, and I was certainly hired for those kind of concrete research outcomes that were specific to classics, rather than, I think, for having, it always helps, I think, to have different things and skills that you can bring to, say, the classroom or research. But that was, my first position. I pitched it as I'm a classicist and or a classical archaeologist. And that was, I think, why I was hired. My second position, so after that job, it was a short-term visiting position. I was hired in a digital humanities position, which was at the University of Nebraska. And it was a good opportunity, and I needed a job, as we do. And it was a classics and digital humanities position. It was sort of part of a cluster hire. So that for that position, I did pitch myself very differently, right? I talked a lot about the kind of big data approach and the digital mapping approach of the project, rather than the kind of content of the classic side of the project. So I was there for 3 years at Nebraska, and they have a great digital humanities community, and it was a really productive time. And then ultimately, I went back to a classics centered position in my job now at Toronto. So I've sort of been in a variety of different roles regarding digital humanities or classics or something in between. Yeah, so it's been different positions with different expectations, and I think they've come with me thinking of myself in a slightly different way. So at Nebraska, for example, a lot of what I was expected to do was apply for and get grants, which is a lot of the reason I think the administration liked the digital humanities people versus, say, the regular humanities people, was that you could acquire these big grants, which bring prestige and bring funding to the university. And so I had to think a lot about what could I do that was innovative in a digital space, more so than what am I doing that's impacting on my particular discipline. Whereas now I'm sort of rewarded for other things. and less digital stuff and more content stuff. So it really, I think the institutional context really does drive the way that you approach your work. And, you know, there are good and bad sides to both kinds of positions, I think.
Thank you. That's a really thoughtful answer. And I think that consideration of how the institutional context will drive how you think about your own work and is actually a really important point that maybe isn't talked about as much as it ought to be. How about we move now to Xander?
Great, thanks. Like Sarah said earlier, I think of it, DH, my relationship to DH, less as being DH than just a tool and a methodology that I really believe in and believe in its potential. So for me, I'm trying as much as possible to incorporate it into my field, and it seems like it's happening more and more in contemporary literature and the sociology of literature. You know, Matt Wilkins has talked about our problem of abundance, you know, 100,000 new novels published in English or somewhere thereabouts. I think I saw Eric Fredner somewhere in here. He's worked on that question of how many new books we have each year. So it's a pressing problem of how to make sense of this vast amount of texts and authors and institutions. In my particular search, it was not, as I said, it was not a DH position. It was a position in ostensibly contemporary literature. And the department had just hired a DH specialist the year before through a kind of provostial or division-wide hire. And so this was interesting to me because it told me some information about the institutional context that Sarah was just talking about. I think it's McGill at that moment a couple of years ago was representative of where a lot of departments are, in that there are more people than ever who are interested in DH and its possible incorporation into what they do. There's still many more people in the department who are excited to have another hire from however they could get it, whether through a traditional search or through this kind of provostial initiative. We want to, you know, university-wide hire a bunch more people who do DH. But there were also a lot of people in my department who were, let's say, skeptical, let's say fully, sometimes for some people, fully uninterested in DH methods and their application in the humanities. And so as I was getting ready to apply for this position, I was actually told by a close colleague who knew the department well to be mindful of this as I applied. So one of the things I was thinking a lot about as I prepared my materials was how I could trumpet not my DH work as DH work, not trump, and this is, I guess, specific to this department and this position, but wasn't trying to sort of trumpet the methods or that it was DH, but rather what are the central questions, what are the key findings, and what are the stakes of those findings, and kind of burying a lot of the methodological stuff in the footnotes or in asides, which is also something I like to do in the work itself. I think the best way to make DH work much more widespread, at least in literary studies, is actually to just do a lot of that work rigorously in the notes, in the background. So many of those findings and stakes, you know, were addressed or made possible by DH methods, but I focus more on the headlines than how we got there. But I think it is worth noting that even in this department, that, you know, what was kind of on the line in terms of how they felt and feel about DH methodology, that 3 of the 4 finalists for this position, which was not a DH position, were all, you know, practitioners of DH in one way or another. So that was representative to me, that even though they weren't making that a big part of their application, it showed me how widespread this has really become in my particular field, and that was really exciting.
Thanks so much, Xander. Rachel, take it away.
Yes, so my training is as an early modern Europeanist, and there are, again, very limited jobs for that. The year that I applied, which was the 2019-2020 year, but importantly pre-pandemic, there were quite a number of jobs that were listed as early modern European with a preference for a specialization, and that specialization could sometimes be digital history. In some cases, it was actually, and weirdly, like 3 cases, it was early modern European history, preferred specialization in gender history, or digital humanities, like those 2 specifically. And that gives you a sense of how these positions, how these lines are being created, essentially, is that it's a position of compromise among the department, which may be pulling in very different directions, and the administration. So it was very clear to me when I started to interview for some of these positions that likely they were hiring for a gender historian, but the way they'd gotten it listed was to add on digital history because that worked at an administrative level. So it was definitely, you had to figure out from some pretty obscured signals what departments were actually looking for, especially with digital history. I think, and this is probably true for digital humanities in general, but I found it to be especially true for digital history. They're looking for you to bring a vision. They want you to come in and tell them what digital humanities is, because then they want to say that they have it and they can offer courses, and that, you know, they have somebody who's publishing and creating a pipeline for their students, especially if they have master's or PhD students. So that was really my experience, was that it was a whole broad mix. I absolutely shifted how I presented myself depending on the position. At the end of the day, I ended up interviewing for 3 or 4 positions, one of which was a cluster hire where, you know, it was a new center that was just looking for somebody who could be their humanities person. Another one was a very traditional early modern European teaching job. It was a 4-4 teaching load, and they just wanted somebody who could do, you know, Plato to NATO. And then the position that I'm in ended up being the perfect fit for me, which is that they were looking for digital history, so hiring within the history department, but because they already had a lot of faculty focused on American history and 20th century, they had a slight preference for someone who was pre-20th century, non-US. So really the complete flip, right, of an early modern European, and maybe you do some of this other stuff as well. So, you know, it ended up being the perfect fit for me in terms of what I wanted to do. I wanted to both teach, you know, my Renaissance Reformation courses and continue to do research that involved digital methodology. But similarly, I'd say, you know, it didn't hurt for me to come in with a strong vision of what digital humanities was, you know, earned in large part through the work that I'd done with CESTA and the kinds of collaborations I've been a part of.
Thank you. Georgia, bring us home.
Yeah, I think I similarly to Rachel, I was applying to tenure track medieval studies jobs in English departments, and digital humanities is trendy enough that it will be in a job ad, but people might not necessarily know what it is. They don't know what they're asking for, and so you have to come prepared to explain what DH will do for the teaching in that department or the research in that department. I think I was the most successful when I was able to explain, well, so I feel like I'm kind of a weird case because my PhD is in Celtic languages and literatures, but I was trying to get a job in an English department. And so that kind of limited what I was qualified to apply for, even though of course I applied to everything there. At the time, there were about maybe 10 or 11 medieval literature jobs in English departments per job cycle. I also applied to DH postdocs and sort of pure DH positions, but I think I didn't really get any nibbles with those because I think I just seem like kind of a weird beast, like a medievalist who works on Celtic languages and book history and also does DH. Sort of, I don't know if I've ever figured out how to sell myself to anyone except kind of more traditional audiences of English departments. So I was the most successful when I was able to explain how I was combining book history and digital humanities to ask really compelling research questions, because the audiences of the people that are reading your cover letters and interviewing you are interested in more of the outcomes than the idea of DH itself. They want to know, you know, how is this going to help student research? How are you going to incorporate students into your research? So being able to articulate what it is that DH is going to do in the job that you are applying for, I think is really important. And I think mainly I was hired to teach medieval literature and linguistics in my department. And my other skill sets were kind of a bonus that my current department now knows, like, oh, well, we have this faculty member that does this really cool, trendy thing that students seem to really like, and it sort of appeals to increasing humanities enrollment, which is what every English department is obsessed with, of course. And so, yeah, I guess just to sum up, being able to articulate really clearly what DH is to a search committee, because most of them won't know, by way of explaining what it is doing in your research and what it will do for students. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Georgia. So that pivots really nicely onto the next question, which is about your recommendations for people who are thinking about the job market soon, or perhaps even applying in this cycle. But first, I just wanted to flag to everyone that we're probably going to have a bit of time for questions from the audience to the panelists as a group. So what we're going to do at about 1 p.m. is move into breakout rooms, and then you can talk to the panelists in smaller groups and maybe ask more questions that are related to the field or the type of institution or their particular trajectory. But for now, if you actually have a question for the group of panelists as a whole, get it ready. You can either chat it to me or you can raise your hand and I will ask you to unmute yourself once we get to that point. But yeah, but if you have a question, think of one now and I will launch the final round of questions and then we'll take questions from the floor. So as I was saying, we're hoping now to kind of move to your recommendations for people who are considering applying or are trying to deal with how to present themselves with some part of DH in their profile, but in all of your cases, it's not in its own field in this way. That means that you can just go straight into DH jobs and not be affiliated with a field and a more conventional traditional field. And so I think that question of balance is a really interesting one. And one thing that struck me in hearing your answers to previous questions was about how for so many of you, the graduate school was a time when you picked up skills and when maybe this was actually the beginning of your use of DH methods. And so I wonder what you would say in terms of what you would recommend for people who are maybe in the earlier stages of their PhDs now and are interested in DH methods and wondering whether they should go hard into learning different skill sets or whether they should kind of develop a side project that they can comfortably talk about, but not necessarily, but also be able to comfortably speak about their research in a more kind of conventional frame. And also what you might say for people who are getting on to looking at the job market, at opportunities, thinking about whether they can really frame themselves for a DH postdoc, but then also for maybe a more conventional assistant professorship, what advice you might have. So this time, let's start with Xander.
Great, thanks. I'd be the first to say that I don't, and I said this to you over email, May, when you got in touch. I don't feel I have a ton of wisdom in this regard. I feel like I completely right place, right time, and a lot of healthy dose of luck. But what I will say, I totally agree with what you just said about graduate school and Stanford graduate school in particular being a great place and time to pick up new skills. Once you are in any number of types of positions, just the amount of time you have to learn new skills is so much less than it was when I was at Stanford. And I feel like working, one piece of advice I would have would be to get involved in a number of different types of projects. I love doing the graduate fellows in digital humanities through CESTA program because I was encountering people in completely different fields or disciplines, but the research tools and the methods they were using ended up being really helpful, and to get a kind of primer in how you might use that in humanities research was really rewarding. I would say I also agree with what Georgia said about practicing I mean, Stanford is a great place to encounter sort of new and exciting DH methodologies and to work collaboratively in teams with people who are really, really invested in this as a methodology. But it's also a good idea to practice describing your research to colleagues, mentors. I mean, I think we all had the experience describing our research to mentors who were not necessarily DH aligned. and even your friends who are in the field, but ambivalent or even antagonistic to DH? How would you describe your questions and your findings to them in a way that would seem not only not threatening or not intimidating, but not too jargony, not too inside baseball? For me, that meant talking a lot about how what I was doing was essentially a form of archival work, or a form of book history, or a form of institutional history. You know, three modes that are very legible to colleagues, even if they don't care much about DH. This was good practice for the application process, but also for grants and fellowship proposals, for book proposals, even pitches to editors for public venues, which I would say is another piece of advice I would have to think about writing for a public audience. In the humanities, we're seeing this more and more. Venues like the LA Review of Books, Public Books, and others is a great way to describe your research and its findings to a much wider audience, which is great practice when you need to bring it back to colleagues in your department or in other departments. I guess two last things I would say is reach out to the network of alums through CESTA, through Stanford, through your department. I've found, I mean, most of the public writing that I'm working on right now is with two other Stanford, CESTA, and Literary Lab alums, Laura McGrath, who's a professor at Temple, and JD Porter, who is a researcher at the University of Pennsylvania. But I know that we also are keeping close touch with other members of the Lit Lab and other alums from Stanford. As we're developing projects, that's been super helpful to us. But also the larger DH network. I find because it's a relatively young field, people whose work I deeply admired and thought of as like sort of intimidating, forefathers and foremothers of DH that I could never, they were untouchable given their expertise. Sending out a kind of cold email to them, I've been sort of stunned and so pleasantly surprised by how quickly and warmly they've responded. And I guess the last thing I would say is the best part of my DH work at Stanford was how collaborative it was. I can see Mark Algie Hewitt in the chat. He, at the Literary Lab and at CESTA, just created such a culture of collaboration. And I think that is something that as you're applying to any number of jobs, whether in academia or outside of academia, that kind of collaborative lab model is, I think, really compelling. And I think Georgia mentioned this before, but even how you could bring the principles of the kind of lab model to the undergraduate or graduate classroom, I think is exciting for people, even just as pedagogues. Thanks.
Thank you so much. All right, let's move to Rachel.
Yes, I just want to underscore what Alexander was saying about collaboration, because let's see, this year I'm still part of a research group that involves Lucas Schultz, who was a postdoc fellow, and I'm working on co-authoring an article with Ruth and Sebastian Annert, who had been visiting scholars, and I think like my second year of my PhD. So those connections have really continued to pay off down the road. So my particular experience was a little unusual in that I went from my last year of the PhD into this R1 tenure track position, which I think is increasingly rare. And one of the reasons is because now that I'm on the other side of things, I'm seeing how much experience committees are really looking for, and they have, an embarrassment of riches in that regard. My top piece of advice is especially if you put the work in during your PhD, don't assume that postdocs are necessarily easier to get than tenure track positions. I actually had much better luck with tenure track positions than I did with any of the kind of, major prestigious societies of fellows. And the reason for that was because DH had given me so many opportunities for professional development, specifically through that model of going and finding researchers who were doing cool stuff and asking them how I could collaborate with them. And so Giovanna Cesarani's Grand Tour project was something that I was a part of, I think from my second or third year on, and we co-taught a class together, which meant that I was able to say I had been a primary instructor for a DH course. Which is relatively rare, among people coming out of PhD programs. I think that made a big difference that I could show examples of student work, when I came and visited and say, look, this is the kind of projects I have my students doing. So designing courses is great, even if you're not able to take advantage of the ability to be a primary instructor. Use your qualifying exams as a chance to design syllabi and think through how you would actually teach those books, right? That can be a really helpful part of the studying process that then provides you with artifacts you can use down the road. Definitely do the DH fellowship. So similar to Georgia, as an early modern Europeanist, sometimes it can feel like very much two different sides of me, right? That I'm working with computers on the one hand, and then, pre-17th century print on the other hand. So being able to figure out ways to put that together, even if it meant doing two separate projects. And for me, what I did was the dissertation on the one hand, which will be a fairly traditional monograph when that comes out. But on the other hand, I used the certificate and then the fellowship to develop a supporting database and a more digital humanities geared project, which then actually went on to become the article that is linked to in my bio and came out in the Journal of Social History this summer. So having that in the publishing process was really great when I was on the market. It also provided me with job talk material that I would have maybe struggled to dig out of the dissertation, that being more of a traditional scholarly artifact. It's a project that I'm able to continue with today and involve research assistants. Again, something I was able to start doing through the DH fellowship that I'm, now kind of have a workflow for in my current position. So I don't want to talk for too long, but the last thing I do want to say is that training that May had mentioned, really my summers were key. A lot of, in history especially, PhD students tend to do a lot of languages in the summers, and basically in place of languages, I was often doing, this or that DH workshop. They often provide publishing opportunities. So if you, get in on a colloquium that's sponsored by either an EU cost action or an NEH grant, there may be an edited volume that comes out of that. So that can be a great opportunity. And there's also wonderful subsidized training at places like the Digital Humanities Summer Institute at the University of Victoria, where you can just go, and it's not even that far from the Bay Area, right? It's like an hour-long flight. And you can go and hang out and become a part of the community, within 2 or 4 weeks of your summer. So not even that much of a commitment on your part.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And also I want to highlight that Rachel has generously offered to share an annotated cover letter that she wrote for a DH position, which I've just put in the chat. So hopefully that link works for everyone. But thank you very much, Rachel. That is really generous of you. So let's move now to Georgia.
On the subject of cover letters, in general, of course, you want to write a cover letter that's tailored to the kind of the cues that are in the job ad, what the search committee has sort of put their heads together and thought about some kind of ideal candidate that they want. They'll list those different subsets, specializations. If it's a traditional humanities job, but they're sort of looking for something that to grab onto about you that is kind of trendy and current. And then other jobs that are more wholly DH, you can change your cover letter. I absolutely had 2 cover letters. One in which I was able to get really granular about DH stuff, and the other one that was just sort of framing DH as this kind of really cool skill that's going to enrich the classroom and add the sort of creative appeal to your teaching, and it really excites students. So it's okay. It's absolutely okay to have completely different versions of yourself on paper, even though that feels like a very strange thing to do. You can kind of be strategic about dialing up or dialing down the DH element in your work, depending on what job you're applying for. And of course, you may have a sense of what job you would prefer, but in this environment, you're going to be applying to everything. So it's okay to tailor. I think the advice that I can give about interviews and visits are mostly tailored to a SLAC, so like not the SLAC lab, but the small liberal arts college. In the interviews, you want to have very basic explanations ready for people who are complete novices at DH. You'll get someone asking, what is digital humanities? And they don't mean that in the kind of heady theoretical way that we talk about it all the time. They literally just want to know what it is because they don't know. And so you want to be able to explain the importance of the field and what it does for your research and what it does for your teaching and how it helps students. You have to be able to communicate the importance of DH for people who just are not familiar with it at all. So you think of like a 2-minute answer that you can, that it will come up if it's on your CV. They will ask about it in an interview. So you want to be prepared for a very basic explanation. For me, this involved, I had an answer prepared in which I framed my research very clearly as kind of an intersection between book history and manuscript studies and digital humanities. It sort of really helped me to have, and that is true, it helped me to have this sort of explanation of how I was applying the methodology really well worked out in advance before the interviews. SLACs really love involving students in your research. So a really easy low-hanging fruit is to explain how you can incorporate students into your research in DH projects, and how you can incorporate DH into your teaching, sort of have different modules that have DH projects in them for your students. And then another piece of more general advice is that search committees, because they're looking at so many different people, they want to be able to classify you according to kind of your major interesting characteristics. So you want to think of maybe 3 things that you want a search committee to take away from you, that you're just going to constantly emphasize in every interaction that you have with the people that you talk to on campus, and just hammer those throughout the whole experience, just sort of so that they think about you and they say, oh yeah, that's the person who does early modern letters with that crazy digital project, right? So then they remember you, and that is beneficial. And then finally, if you are at the point of getting a campus visit and DH is really your primary field and is really central to your work, you want to ask them what kinds of provisions for DH programming and what support they have for DH projects, especially if your primary field is DH. You want to go somewhere where your projects will really be supported by the institution. I know that it's a bad job market, and so you're going to go wherever you can. But you have to be prepared for there to be no support, no library, no funding, no workshops, nobody else on campus that knows anything about computer science except for the computer science departments, right? And that so everything that you do, especially at a small school, will be just completely DIY. The result of that is that your projects just might go really slowly, which is going to be the case no matter what, because in your first year in a faculty position, you're going to be really struggling to adjust to your teaching load if you're at a teaching school. And so you just want to be prepared for that adjustment from Stanford to a different place that might not have the same levels of institutional support or funding. I'm sort of thinking about, all the workshops that you can go to at the library and all the different things that are going on. All of the sort of the archiving and the support of faculty research projects that happens through the library at Stanford is actually very unusual and doesn't exist at most institutions. So you just want to be prepared for that and get as much of that training as you can while you're still a graduate student. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Georgia. That was so great to have so many concrete and actionable tips that we can all put into action. So Sarah, then if you'd like to round us off.
Okay, I'll say a couple of things. I think those are all great advice that's been said so far, and I agree with all that. I'm sort of old and cynical at this point, so maybe I can provide old cynical person advice. So one thing I think that can be useful, is to again, along the lines of what Georgia was saying, think about what the institution that you're applying to is going to want. And one of those things can be at a project that seems likely to attract grant money. And I think, in a Slack or some kind of environment like that, nobody's going to care as much, but a lot of sort of big research institutions, that's something they're really interested in. So if you have a project coming out of grad school that of course you are not going to get big NEH grants in grad school, but thinking about a project that could sort of scale up to a really big project that would sort of bring attention and a whole team of people through grant funding to an institution, I think that can be really attractive on the job market. Sort of growing off of that, though, I think, my advice for students often is just like don't necessarily follow trends, and don't do digital humanities because it's trendy and there are opportunities that pertain to digital humanities. I think you always want to follow like your research nose when you're developing your strategy as a grad student, and do what seems exciting to you. I think a lot of students now feel like they should do digital humanities because there are these positions that are specific to digital humanities, and that's great, if it makes sense for your project, but I don't think it always makes sense, and so I think it's important to be, aware that no one's going to hire you just because you have a digital humanities background, right? There has to be some other, something else that usually would accrue from the value of the research project, and the fit between the research and the methods that you're using that are digital. Yeah, but I think one thing that's important too is to realize that when you're in grad school, you do have a lot of time to experiment and to learn new skills that you won't have as a new faculty member. And so it's a good time to sort of check it out. I mean, I don't think there's any harm in acquiring these skills, meeting new people. Like Xander was saying, the community of digital humanities people tend to be more collaborative and more open to collaboration and more sort of generous in that sense sometimes than regular traditional humanists. So you'll always learn a lot from spending time around a place like CESTA. For my research, I thought a lot about how you visualize information because of the kind of conversations we had at CESTA. And that was really productive in my research, even outside of the bounds of what we were doing with the project. So the skills and like the kind of ideas that you get from engaging with digital humanities people, I think will always be valuable, whether or not you end up marketing yourself as digital humanities or not. Yeah, last piece of advice is be honest about your skills when you apply for jobs. Like what you don't want to do is say, oh, I know how to do this, I know how to program in this programming language, when you've just done like a little workshop on it and don't know how, and I've seen this happen in interviews on campus, especially, is you sort of say you know how to do something and then you show up and you're not really knowing how to do it, and then it makes you look bad. So it's tempting on a resume or on paper to say like, oh, I know how to do this, and I use Gephi, and people can call you on that. So again, always be sort of true to what you are really. You can manipulate your CV and your letters to play up, or dial up and down, like Georgia was saying, different aspects of your research. But don't, always be true to what you actually are and what you're interested in, regardless of the opportunity.
Thank you so much. So I think we have time for one question, and there's a question here from Eric Fredner, which is, could you say something about how you perceive conversations about hiring to have shifted at your institutions as a result of the pandemic and in the kind of time period of the last couple of years? So I'm not sure if anyone would like to jump in. We don't have to do a formal go around, but if anyone would like to kind of share what they perceive the conversations to be, if the climate around hiring or around hiring DH kind of skills and positions, whether any of that has shifted what you've observed.
I just throw in one thing on this. Hi, Eric. Is that at so many institutions of all sizes that there have been hiring freezes, which are exacerbating problems in acquiring searches for humanities departments that were already the case. So I just want to underline to what Rachel said before, that some of these job ads are really rich with subtextual information about how this search came about. I know I'm on a search right now that we have been trying we had a series of departmental priorities that we were hoping to get hires for, and this one was not necessarily one of them, but it came through a kind of provostial hire. It came through a university-wide or faculty of arts wide hire. And so to just, as Rachel said, be canny about looking at like, okay, well, you have to get through the department. What does the department want? Can I see in the job app that there's a kind of blending of what the department wants with the way that with the vehicle that they were able to use to actually get this hire in the first place?
Yeah, stalking the actual faculty pages is your friend. Because, for example, you might see that they don't clearly have anybody doing digital history, but they may also not have anyone who is capable of teaching courses pre-1800, for example. And so that's, one of those aspects you can be sure to highlight. I unfortunately can't speak too much to the job market prior to the pandemic. I will say that at large state institutions, there still seems to be a fair amount of hiring happening, especially now that fair amount, now that the bottleneck of the past year and a half is slowly letting up.
I think what
Right.
oh, sorry. I'll just throw in something general, which is that I haven't seen in my discussions with other people at other institutions and just sort of seeing what's on the market in medieval literature right now. It seems like in addition to the hiring freeze, there's a lot of cases of a tenure track line being replaced with a VAP or a 2 or 3 to 4 year position. That seems increasingly common. I mean, it's better than tenure lines not getting replaced at all. But I think a lot of institutions are nervous about the future and they're not willing to commit to hiring somebody as tenure track. And I think that has less to do with the pandemic, although that is an exacerbating factor, as the predicted decline in the number of college students that will exist in 5 or 10 years, and in the declining interest in the humanities in general across the board, which is of course nothing new, but it is affecting hiring in terms of the length of time that you might work at one place. Yeah, I just wanted to throw that in. I don't have any solutions. It's probably one of the biggest problems that we have.
Thanks, Georgia. No, I think that's a really useful perspective to hear. So before we move to the breakout rooms, which we're going to attempt to do now, I think it would be great if everyone can just do a silent Zoom round of applause for our panelists who have so generously answered questions today. This has been really wonderful.